Hello. My name is Vincent David. I'm the editor of Spartacist, and I want to talk about why can't anyone stop Netanyahu? That is the question that is posed after a year of Israeli onslaught against the Palestinians. And since a year since October 7, the infernal Zionist machine has massacred tens of thousands of Palestinians. And now, through continuous escalation, it now threatens a major regional war. So, in April, Israel bombed the Iranian embassy in Syria. In July, it assassinated Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. And since then, it has engaged in a new offensive in Lebanon against Hezbollah, exploding thousands of pagers, killing its leaders, including Hassan Nasrallah, and launching a devastating bombing campaign in southern Lebanon, displacing hundreds of thousands. In response to Israel's crime, millions of people have demonstrated. The International Criminal Court has opened an investigation, and Iran and Hezbollah have shot missiles at Israel. However, nothing seems to deter Israel's escalation. And part of the explanation to this is that Netanyahu's government of fanatics and butchers have a clear objective: the ethnic cleansings of Palestinians from the river to the sea. And the obstacle it confronts is that over the past decades, Iran has gradually eroded Israel's military dominance in the region. Now, Iran has developed advanced weaponry, including the technology for nuclear weapons, and Iran has also taken advantage of disastrous U.S. military interventions in the region to develop a network of powerful militias. And these developments are viewed by the Israeli government as an existential threat to the Zionist project. So now the Zionists, right, see a historic opportunity to deal a crippling blow against Iran. And Israel's population has been marshaled into a genocidal frenzy since October the 7th. Its international reputation is already sort of in tattered, and the U.S. promises unconditional support. And it's in this context that Netanyahu believes he can escalate the conflict and secure either a major capitulation from Iran or drag the US into a direct war with the Islamic Republic. And in either case, he hopes to ensure unopposed expansion onto remaining Palestinian land and the long term defense of Israel's border. But the question remains of this video: why can't anyone stop Netanyahu? Why is he always on the offensive, and why does he always seem to have the momentum? And in some cases, the answer is quite obvious. The U.S., while it probably doesn't want a war with Iran, this is entirely secondary to their ironclad commitment to defend Israel no matter what. And even if Biden was not completely senile, the lack of political determination to stop Israel's aggression would still remain in the US. And as for the governments of Britain, of Germany, of France, of Japan, and other advanced democracies, in the end, they are sycophants committed to upholding the US world order, even if it leads to the devastation of their own economies. And so they're not about to put up a fuss. But what about the forces opposing Israel, such as Iran, or the millions of people who have demonstrated against the genocide in Gaza? Why haven't they been able to stop the bloody spiral of violence in West Asia? And here we must look at the balance of military force, but also more broadly, we must look at the political outlook of the various opponents to Netanyahu. And as we shall see, the real reason why Netanyahu and his government haven't been stopped is that its opponents lack a bold and coherent program to defeat Zionism and throw off imperialist domination in the region. So, first, we must look at the axis of resistance led by Iran, which includes Hezbollah and the Houthis in Yemen. And unlike most other Muslim regimes that condemn Israel in speeches but then do nothing and remain completely aligned with the US, the Iranian regime has directly confronted Israel, including by launching missiles onto its territory. However, this display of force, like we saw on October the 1st, does not prove that the axis of resistance is committed to Palestinian liberation, nor that it has any sort of coherent plan to defeat Israel, or more importantly, the US. And actually, when you look closely at it, the opposite is true. The overriding priority of the Iranian regime is the preservation of the theocratic Shia regime. And since it was established after the overthrow of the Shah in 1979, which was a US puppet, the regime has been in continuous conflict with imperialist interests in the entire region. At the same time, the theocratic and capitalist nature of the regime limits Iran's ability to push back and defeat imperialism by uniting the people of the entire region in a common struggle. And the problem of the regime start with Iran's own people, many of whom hate living under the whip of Islamic law and the regime of the mullahs. So women in particular are denied the most basic democratic rights, like the right to dress however they want. And Iran also includes many different nationalities and religious groups which suffer oppression at the hand of the clerical regime. And these internal tensions, for example, were on full display in 2022 during the social explosion that occurred after the death of Gina Amini. So, this tense internal situation means that whatever threat comes from the US or Israel, it must always be balanced with stabilizing the domestic front, which in many ways appears much more dangerous to the ruling clerics. And this explains why, in the midst of Israel's genocide in Gaza, the Ayatollah allowed Masoud Pezeshkian to run for president and get elected on a platform of pacification with the West and concession with the West. And so it's important to understand that this was not some sort of big U turn, but is actually the logic of the doctrine of strategic patience in regard to Israel, which is the doctrine of the Iranian regime. So the reformist wing of the regime thinks that it can avoid a direct confrontation with Israel and obtain economic concession from the West, and then through this it will be able to reduce internal tensions and secure the stability of the regime. And the reformists in Iran are quite conscious that the price to pay for such concession is to stab the Palestinians and their allies in the back. So in late September, for example, right as Israel was actively decapitating Hezbollah, which is Iran's main ally in the region, President Pezeshkian was in New York making an open appeal to the US to reopen the 2015 nuclear negotiations. And the shocking inaction at Israel's aggression against Lebanon was justified by a regime insider, which was quoted in the Financial Times, and which says, quote, inevitably, some important issues are being set aside for more urgent ones, at least temporarily. This is the price you pay when you adjust your approach in battle, i.e., the issue of Palestine is being set aside for the narrow interest of maintaining the Shia regime in place in Tehran. There is, of course, in Iran another wing of the ruling class, which are called the hardliners, who want to impose a more draconian religious order internally and pursue a more confrontational stance against Israel. And it is indeed possible that in a long attritional war with Israel and the US, Iran could come on top. But this would come at a terrible price and at great risk to the regime. Of course, the US and Israel are very powerful militarily. But in addition to this is the fact that Iran's war effort would be hampered by its religious character. Think about it. Given the nature of the Islamic Republic, any war or any offensive against Israel and the US would have to be based on Shia secularism.
I obviously meant Shia sectarianism.
On this basis, it is impossible to unite the peoples of the entire regions against imperialism and Zionism. More so, such a war would alienate actually a lot of people in West Asia and make it easy for the enemy and as well the Sunni regimes hostile to the Shia to foster religious and national conflicts among the various oppressed groups. So, this consideration makes a war with Israel much more costly and its outcome much more uncertain for the ruling clerics in Iran. A good example of this is provided by Lebanon itself. So the French colonialists consciously built Lebanon along sectarian lines in order to divide and rule and pit various religious groups against each other. You have the Shia, you have the Sunnis, you have the Christians. But instead of overcoming such division and striving to unite the Sunni, the Shia, the Christians against imperialism in Israel, um, Iran has focused its effort on building Hezbollah, a Islamist militia based on the Shia community. So this means that any conflict with Israel, Hezbollah must not only confront the external foe, but also balance relations with other religious groups inside Lebanon. And this consideration is certainly a huge factor in Hezbollah's restraint since October 7. It's not just Iran. So clearly, neither Hezbollah nor Iran is confident in their ability to confront Israel at the current time. And in recent weeks, Netanyahu was able to exploit this wavering and this indecision of his adversaries to devastating effects. Israel succeeded in decapitating Hezbollah's leadership and exposed Iran as a really unreliable ally. And facing humiliation, the Iranian regime finally responded by shooting a salvo of 180 ballistic missiles at Israel. And now the initiative is again back in the hands of Israel, which will decide whether it wants to further escalate the conflict. One must keep in mind that it is by no means assured that an all-out war in the Middle East would see the position of the US and Israel strengthened. Actually, quite the contrary is likely. That said, for Palestinian liberation and working class emancipation to be advanced, one cannot count on the axis of resistance. Instead, what's required is a program that is intransigent in its opposition to imperialism and that can unite the peoples of the Middle East. And the pillars of such program have to be to defend Gaza, the West Bank, Yemen, Lebanon, and Iran against Zionist and imperialist attacks, certainly, but also for the national liberation of Palestine and recognition of full national rights, including self determination, for all the nations throughout the region, including the nations oppressed by the Iranian regimes. An opposition to state religions and no imposition of the veil, and nationalization of property of the imperialists in the region as well as their domestic stooges. And that are the fundamental planks of a program throughout the Middle East to unite the various population against imperialism and Zionism. So, despite the wishful thinking of the ideologues of the axis of resistance, Israel is not a paper tiger. It will not collapse if its narratives gets exposed or even if it suffers economic blows, even serious ones. The two pillars of Israel's strengths are the support it receives from the US and the existence of a consolidated Jewish nation on the territory of Palestine. This means that even if it were possible to inflict a disastrous military defeat on Israel, which would put its very existence into question, there is no doubt that the Zionists would be able to inflict catastrophic destruction and that much of the Israeli population would fight to the better end for their national existence. And so, military confrontation of the entire Israeli nation guarantees the maximum resistance and destruction. And so, for this reason, if one is serious about fighting for Palestinian liberation, it must have a strategy to undermine Israel's national unity and break an important segment of the population, the Jewish population, from Zionism. And the past few years have shown that there are indeed important fissures in Israeli society. The tensions within Israel reflect the country's inexorable slide towards becoming a totalitarian militarized theocracies, even for the Jews. And This goes to show that a society which is built on national oppression not only degrades the oppressed, so the Palestinians in this case, but also drags the oppressing nation into nothing less than barbarity. So both the 2023 mass demonstration against Netanyahu's anti-democratic judicial reform and the more recent demonstrations demanding a ceasefire and the release of the hostages in Gaza were movements which were all based on the liberal wing of the Zionist ruling class. And this pole of Israeli society pushes back against the more like bellicose and theocratic facets of government policy, while at the same time being fully committed to Zionism, that is, to the oppression of Palestinians. And this gives liberal Zionism certainly a reactionary character, but it also means that it's totally impotent in confronting the right wing of Israeli society. And the logic of Zionism is such that the most rabid and confrontational faction of the ruling class will always be more consistent than those who drape themselves in high minded ideal while continuing to defend the oppression of Palestinians. And the bankruptcy of liberal Zionist movement is shown clearly by the fact that they evaporate the minute Israel's national defense is posed in any kind of ways. So after October 7, some of Netanyahu's strongest opponents rushed to join his government of national unity. And following Israel's offensive against Lebanon, the movement to free the hostages immediately worked to completely demobilize itself. And the basic fact is that there can be no serious opposition to Netanyahu's bands of fanatics without a political break with Zionism in a defense of Palestinian liberation. This is why the political climate in Israel always moves further and further and further and further to the right. So there do exist in Israel small forces that stand against Palestinian oppression. And however, while they face tremendous repression, they fail to confront the obstacle that liberal Zionism represents. So there are many groups, for example, which, under the argument that because Israel is a settler colonial state, basically believe that nothing can be done to break the Israeli working class from Zionism. And for them, the task is simply to stand in liberal solidarity with Palestine, and showing their solidarity without affecting Israeli society at all. And then there are the likes, like groups like the International Socialist Alternative or others, um, which cheer on liberal Zionist movement. And so, for example, they hailed the one-day general strike in early September while raising no opposition to Zionism and sweeping under the rug the fact that it was organized by a labor bureaucracy in the trade unions, which is entirely committed to the national oppression of Palestinians. And so, in both cases, these two trends, there is an unwillingness or an incapacity to confront workers' deeply entrenched Zionist beliefs and the thoroughly Zionist leadership of the Israeli working class. And so, to crack Israeli society, it's key to go beyond the ideas in the head of individuals and look at the material interest of the various classes. While Israel does benefit from a higher standard of living, given its role as a pawn of imperialism in the region, conditions for Israeli workers, including Jewish workers, are not good. Palestinian oppression does not benefit Jewish workers. It drags them down by making them powerless to defend their interests in the face of their patriotic bosses and rulers. And it also turns them into enforcer of the barbaric oppression of Palestinians, threatening their lives and that of their families, and honestly degrading their own humanity. And the key to unlocking these contradictions is to undermine Zionism with a program that is directed both at the right wing and liberal wing of Zionism. This program consists, among other things, for full democratic rights for all Palestinians from the river to the sea, because Israeli workers will never be free as long as Palestinians are oppressed. It requires breaking the connection with the US, because serving as agents for imperialism will never bring safety. And it means fighting for the redistribution of land and wealth to workers and to the Palestinians. Now, to stop the Israeli onslaught, it is essential to stop the flow of weapons from the West to Israel and centrally from the United States. And now we must look a little more at the movement for Palestine in the West. And I'll focus in particular to the US because this is really the key central place, the superpower of the planet. And the problems of the pro-Palestinian movement in the US is also quite similar of the problem it faces in countries like Britain, France, Germany, etc. And so over the past year, there's been countless pro-Palestinian demonstration and even a short-lived but militant student movement against the genocide in Gaza on campuses. I will link in the description an article written by our American comrades over the lessons of the encampment struggle, which is worth the read. So, however, in the past few weeks, the movement for Palestine in the US has to a large degree completely liquidated itself in order to avoid damaging the presidential campaign of Kamala Harris, who everyone knows is completely committed to the defense of Israel. And nothing symbolizes the current impasse more than the pathetic, uncommitted movement. So a few months ago, it encouraged Democratic Party primary voters to write uncommitted on their ballot as a pressure tactics on the party leadership. And although thousands did follow the lead, it predictably achieved nothing, and it was shoved to the curb by the Democratic Party leadership. The movement was even denied its miserable demand of having one single Palestinian speaker at the Democratic Chicago Convention, any Palestinian speaker. And now, after weeks of groveling and nothing to show for their effort, the uncommitted movement declined to endorse Kamala Harris and advocate instead to vote against Trump, but not for a third party, i.e., vote for Kamala Harris. And so, this lamentable spectacle, which by the way was cheered at every step by most of the socialist left, goes a long way to explain why the Palestinian movement in the West has been so ineffective in wresting the slightest concession, much less stop the flow of weapons to Israel. Instead of building a working class opposition to both parties of US imperialism, um, as each competes to be more Zionist, Republicans or Democrats, um, the Palestinian movement has simply latched itself onto the Democrats. And the absurdity of this strategy is shown by the fact that even Palestinian American Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, who has attracted the anger of the entire U.S. establishment and media, has remained in the Democratic Party, despite the fact that the Democratic Party supports genocide. And this shows that it is not the Palestinian movement that has influenced the Democratic Party, but rather it is the Palestinian movement which has sacrificed itself for the Democratic Party. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of Boeing machinists and ILA longshoremen have engaged in strike action. And even though the ILA criminally continued to ship weapons, the strikes certainly caused much more disruption to U.S. arms manufacturers than any campus occupation we've seen. And the problem is that the pro Palestinian movement is utterly incapable of connecting with these workers, many of whom hate the liberal establishment to their bones and would rather vote Trump. And at best, liberal activists for Palestine at best can make some sort of moral case as to why workers should support Palestine. And at worst, many of them treat these workers as just conservative, treat them with contempt, and believe that they are part of the problem too. And what the liberals miss is the basic point that it is not in the material interest of American workers to ship missiles that cause death and destructions all over the world. It's the children of American workers which will be sent to kill or be killed in a war in the Middle East. And many workers somewhat know that the increased insecurity, precarity they face in their own lives is connected with America's forever wars abroad. And instead of the Palestinian movement, uh, instead of latching itself to the party supporting genocides and breaking strikes, the Democratic Party, and instead of peddling liberal drivel to the working class, the Palestinian movement must seek to connect the cause of Palestine to that of working class emancipation in the United States itself. This means to fight to stop arms shipment to Israel, because U.S. crimes abroad will come at the expense of workers at home. It means also connecting Palestinian liberation with black liberation in the United States. The black liberation struggle being a key motive force of any advances for the entire working class in the US. And it needs to oppose both Democrats and Republicans and fight for a workers' party. And our comrades in the US are campaigning to vote for the Party for Socialism and Liberation in the current US presidential elections. Now, let's move to the BRICS, where many see an alternative there to the US dominated order. Now, there's a saying that says that an effective alliance is one which the whole is stronger than the sum of its part. And the BRICS plus bloc is precisely the opposite of that. And when it comes to Palestine or any great geopolitical conflicts, the BRICS is utterly irrelevant. The problem is that each member country has completely contradictory interests. So on the question of Gaza, for example, while you have like a member state like Iran, which is directly confronting Israel, you have on the other India, which has actually close relations with Israel and which is ruled by a chauvinist anti-Muslim party. And so clearly, when it comes to Palestine, the BRICS plus as a bloc plays no role whatsoever, no independent role. However, others look, to the other bigger countries that compose this bloc, like Russia and China. So Russia has been providing a degree of military support to Iran, including like air defense batteries. However, Russia seems much more intent on avoiding a regional escalation than advancing the cause of Palestinian liberation. And ultimately, despite the hue and cry about Russian imperialism, there's actually no signs that Russia is trying to make use in any way of the situation to push US influence out of the Middle East. Rather, Russia right now is focused on finishing the war in Ukraine and grounding down the Ukrainian army and eventually reaching a settlement with the US over Europe's future security arrangement. And China, surely a regime that claims to be communist, would provide material support to the Palestinian resistance, and just like the Soviet Union did to the Palestine Liberation Organization. No. Beyond empty gestures and pacifist platitudes, the Communist Party of China has not lifted a finger for the Palestinian cause. And this is true despite the fact that Palestinian liberation and the expulsion of American power from West Asia would go a long way towards helping China and reducing the threat that it is facing by the US to in East Asia. But the Chinese Communist Party is too busy cozying up with Gulf aristocrats and Israeli capitalists to pay any attention to anti imperialism and national liberation struggles, not to speak of proletarian revolution. And if you just have a quick look at Global Times, one of the main Anglophone publication of the Chinese Communist Party, it's like they live in a parallel world where Israeli onslaught barely exists in the headlines. So, of all the BRICS country, or at least the first initial countries which founded BRICS, South Africa has probably done the most to signal that it stands with Palestine, and to much fanfare and praise, it brought a case against Israel for genocide at the International Court of Justice. The result? Nothing, of course, because such institutions as the ICJ are only intended to target fallen African dictators and enemies of the US, and it is an institution entirely dominated by the US and for its interests. But this empty show of moral support had much more to do with shoring up President Ramaphosa and the ANC's left flank before the recent elections, which took place in South Africa, than really a serious commitment to Palestinian liberation. And in fact, right after the elections of President Ramaphosa, in South Africa, he jumped into a coalition with the Democratic Alliance, who are the heirs of the apartheid regime and rabidly Zionists. And so the Palestinians will get no assistance of this government. Does this mean that the situation is hopeless? Far from it, actually. One does not need to praise the BRICS to accept that America's grip on the world is getting weaker, and billions of workers throughout the world uh, and also oppressed people have only misery and war to expect from the US and its crumbling world order. And once you stop putting faith in the rotten regimes that conciliate and support the status quo, it becomes clear that there is actually a huge potential in uniting all the victims of US imperialism around the world, from Palestine to Mexico to the Philippines, and all the way to the United States itself. And for that, what's necessary to fight for throughout the what is called often the global south is for an anti-imperialist united front against Israel and the US, to fight for the nationalization of imperialist assets and cancel the debts of these countries, and to shake off any illusions in the BRICS and fight rather for the unity of workers and peasants throughout the world. So what next? The situation is bleak. We have to state it, as it is. Every day more Palestinians are killed by the IDF, and hundreds of thousands and even millions face starvation, disease, displacement. In the West Bank, more and more Palestinian land is being stolen, and Israel's now shows every sign of seeking to turn Lebanon into a new Gaza and to bomb Iran into submission. Whether it will succeed or not is another matter. However, in the last, what the last, if the last year has showed one thing, is that there is no place for fatuous and stupid optimism. The UN, the ICC, the ICJ, the BRICS, the Muslim regimes, the international community, quote unquote, none will come to the aid of Palestinians. It is time to face the hard reality and draw lessons from the disastrous results of the past 12 months. The current leaders of the Palestinian resistance are not up to the task, nor are the leaders of the pro Palestinian movements internationally, whether in the West or in the global South. Communists and socialists have little currency in the Arab world, in large part because they failed for 100 years to provide a road forward for genuine national and social liberation. And on this, I would recommend to people to read our article, Marxists in Palestine, 100 Years of Failures, Lessons, and Prospect. I also did a two-part video on this article, which you can find on our channel, and I'll link them in the description. So while the Marxists have failed for 100 years, like we stayed out, and while this is necessary to fight for a new course for the Marxists, it is also becoming clear that the forces of political Islam do not have an answer either. And this provides actually an opening for the workers' movement to enter the fray on the side of Palestinians and really provide an alternative, a new course for the Palestinian liberation struggle. And the task at hand is really to fuse the domestic struggles of workers internationally in all the various countries I spoke about with that of Palestinian liberation. And that will be possible only if there is a struggle, a political fight against the bankrupt road offered by the labor bureaucrats, the liberals, the left Zionists, the conciliators that I've all mentioned throughout this video, and who are the ones who have called the shot so far in the resistance, in the Palestinian resistance. And it is the urgent responsibility of all socialists, working class militants, and Palestinian activists to start debating and organizing the struggle for a new course to advance the Palestinian cause, because we cannot allow the next year to be like the last year. So, like and subscribe for more. Follow our website for more articles, for more analysis on the Palestinian struggle, and much more. And see you next time.